Thank you for that nice introduction, Josafá. It's a pleasure to be here today, so thank you for inviting me to join you. I will give you a brief overview first of a few of my international collaborative efforts, just to give you a sense of the perspective that I'm bringing to the discussion today. And then I'll try to walk through some very concrete tips and strategies. And then at the end, we'll have time for discussions and questions. So that's the general plan for today. So just to give you a little bit of a sense about some of my international collaborations, I've been the principal investigator of a project called Parenting Across Cultures. That's a longitudinal study of mothers, fathers, and children, where we recruited the sample at the age of 8 and we're following them till the age of 22 in 13 cultural groups in 9 countries. And I'll give you a little bit more information about that, but much of the many of the tips that I'll be talking about today stem from our experiences in that project. I've also done some consulting for UNICEF, especially regarding standards for parenting programs in several different countries. And I've consulted with the Doha International Family Institute on child well-being in the Gulf countries. And that's led to a couple of shorter-term international collaborations. And I'll describe those as well to try to talk about not only how research collaborations can happen in a long-term way, but also ways that you might be able to launch collaborations that are more time limited just to reach some sort of short-term concrete goal. I'm also serving on the Secretariat of the International Consortium of Developmental Science Societies, and that includes several developmental organizations, including ISSBD, as well as a number of others. And the idea for that is to bring scientific societies that focus on child and adolescent and human development together to have international partnerships among these developmental science societies. And then another kind of collaborative role I've been in is serving as chair of the US National Committee for Psychological Science. And that reports to the International Union of Psychological Sciences, which is kind of like a United Nations for psychology. So there are a number of different ways, I think, that you can collaborate in international research. And some of the tips that I'll share with you today stem from these different kinds of roles. I should say that if at any point you have a hard time seeing me or hearing me, let Josafá know, and then maybe Josafá can let me know if I need to do something different on my end to make this easier to see or hear. So I won't say much about the need for international research because I'm guessing that just by virtue of your being on the webinar today, you are probably buy into the idea that it's important to collaborate internationally. But I think the main reasons for doing it is that our science is really suffers if we don't understand child development in a number of different cultural contexts. And so this practice of studying individuals only in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries really restricts what's known about the majority of people living in the world. And we can't generalize about development beyond the limited range of settings in which children have primarily been studied. And so international collaborative research can advance the scientific agenda to address generalizability and really challenge what we know based on the limited samples that have been studied to date. So I think in terms of kind of some just overarching conceptual issues in international collaborative research, one big one is avoiding adopting a deficit perspective. So I think this has been a criticism of a lot of research in which a researcher from one cultural context goes into another cultural context with beliefs and expectations that that somehow say, okay, we're coming to understand something that's not as good as the norm. And so it's important not to come into cross-cultural or international research thinking that one group is in some way better than or worse than another group. So really having an open mind, I think, is critical with this whole enterprise. And international research really lets us challenge what are regarded as standard patterns of development. And those have been studied disproportionately in these Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic settings. And so even things that seem as basic as visual perception differ depending on cultural context. And so when you're thinking about all of the complexities of human development, it's safe to think that things really may not generalize. And so it's important to be able to test the limits of what we know and challenge what we think are standard developmental principles by expanding to other settings. Another issue that's specific to developmental science, I think, is understanding the relation between age and development. Clearly, age and development are important issues in developmental science. And some of the classic theories of development, for example, set milestones of what we think children should be able to accomplish at different ages. But a lot of that is really culturally grounded. So what expectations a society holds for an 8-year-old may differ from expectations in another society. And some of those have to do with what the child is allowed and expected to do. So a child in one setting may be expected at the age of 8 to walk long distances to collect water alone, whereas in other societies, an 8-year-old may not even be able to cross the street alone. And so that's just a kind of a simple example of how age and development may be related in different ways in different societies, and that's a big issue for developmental scientists. So let me talk more specifically about the Parenting Across Cultures project before I get into kind of some more of the logistical tips of conducting international collaborative research. So Parenting Across Cultures is the study I referred to at the beginning that's been conducted in 9 countries. So those countries are China, Colombia, Italy, Jordan, Kenya, Sweden, the Philippines, Thailand, and the United States. And the study began by recruiting 8-year-olds, approximately 8-year-olds on average, from schools in 9 countries. We also recruited the children's mothers and fathers to participate in the project. And the sample size for each cultural group was roughly 100, give or take a little bit. We're now in our 11th annual year of data collection, and the participants are now 19 years old on average. So I give you this is a little bit of background to talk about kind of how we started the collaborations that led to this ongoing research project and what we've done to maintain those collaborations over these years. So here's one photo of many of the collaborators in the Parenting Across Cultures work group. This is at one of our annual meetings, and it doesn't include everybody in our group, but it includes investigators from many of the countries. And here's another picture from our group. So many of the pictures in these slides will show our group meeting in different countries and at different points in the development of our group. So this was early in our collaboration. And so when we had these ideas initially about doing this longitudinal study of parenting and child development, there were a few different considerations in terms of how we were going to start these collaborations. One is that the questions that drove us initially had to do with parents' discipline strategies and children's development. So conceptually, we wanted to choose countries that we thought could be informative about the specific research questions. But then there would be any number of countries that could have been useful to include from that perspective. But we also had the practical and logistical aspect of, okay, so how are we going to find collaborators in these countries to work on this longitudinal project? So some of that involved reaching out to colleagues of colleagues. So for example, if we knew that we wanted to target a particular country but didn't know someone there, but we had colleagues who had colleagues in that country, that kind of networking was one way that we approached it. We also, some of these connections happened almost by lucky chance. I was doing some consulting work for UNICEF, and during a coffee break at a meeting for that UNICEF group working on parenting programs, I started talking with a woman from Jordan, Suha Al-Hassan, who ended up becoming a long-term collaborator, and we've been working together for years now. And it was just because we started talking during a coffee break and realized we had a lot of the same research interests. And the two of us ended up writing a grant proposal together that allowed us to add Jordan as a site to this international collaborative work. So one tip is just to be open to those kinds of networking opportunities that professional conferences provide. And ISSBD is really good at that. ISSBD has regional workshops that can be a great place to network and find collaborators, as well as, of course, the meetings, including the upcoming one in Greece. The Human Development Intervention Network is another idea. This is the website that is listed here. You can sign up on this website for free. You create a profile that lists your research interests, and once you've created a profile, you're able to use that that network on the website to look at other people's profiles, and it can be a way of saying, oh, okay, there's this person in this other country who has similar research interests to mine, and at least you could, it would be a way to learn more about that person and potentially connect in this virtual way to start at least talking with each other. As you're thinking about collaborators, I really stress the importance of collaborating with scholars in the communities to be studied. So for example, in Parenting Across Cultures, we didn't want this to be a group of researchers who were from one place, but studying people in all of these other countries without having people from those countries is part of the research team. So we have PhD level investigators who are at universities in each of the 9 countries. And then our main collaborators in each of the 9 countries then staff their project using graduate students or people from the community. So it's really not outsiders collecting data in one particular place and then kind of extracting the data, but it's truly a collaboration of people who are living and working in the communities that we're studying. So that was all about the Parenting Across Cultures project, and I'll come back to that as well. But I also wanted to note that collaborations can also be organized around a time-limited goal. It doesn't always have to be that you're starting off this collaboration thinking that you're going to be collaborating with these people for the next 20 years, which can feel quite daunting and may not be realistic for a number of different reasons. But here are some ideas of ways that you can launch international collaborations around a very specific goal, and that may or may not lead to something longer term. So you can organize a conference symposium. That's a really good way to have a chance to connect with people whose research you admire and you think fits well with yours. So if you're organizing a symposium, it would mean reaching out to 3 or 4 other people probably and saying, you know, hey, do you want to put together a symposium that we would present at this upcoming conference? And that may lead just to the symposium, or it may lead to longer term connections. But either way, that's one kind of concrete time-limited goal you could have. Special issues of journals and edited books are a bit more of a commitment than a conference symposium would be, but they also have a clear goal and kind of an endpoint in sight. And this group that's shown in this picture here came together along just such a thing. This is a group that met at the University of Cambridge over the summer, and it's part of a conference that's an annual conference that meets at the University of Cambridge, where researchers can present or can propose to do a workshop related to some issue in the Gulf region. So Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, then the expectation is that there will be an edited book that comes out of the workshop. And so this group here met together for several days over the summer, and people before this meeting submitted chapters, draft chapters. We gave each other feedback on the chapters during the course of the meeting. And now people are revising their chapters and will submit those chapters to be included as an edited book. So it's not that we're necessarily involved in each other's research projects, but we are, that it is now a collaborative group from many different countries. And we've met in person, and we're putting together this book that will be this time-limited kind of goal. So that's another idea. You can, in editing a special issue of a journal, there are sometimes calls that you might see for journals that are interested in proposals for special issues. And so if you come up with a proposal, then that also gives you a chance to think about who you'd want to contribute to a special issue, and you can reach out to potential authors, and that's a way that you can also start start some international collaborations around a goal of producing a special issue of a journal. Funding becomes a question a lot of times in how to start and maintain international collaborations. I've listed a few ideas here. ISSBD regional workshops can be a great thing. Those usually provide at least some funding for attendees. There are summer schools that are hosted by several developmental science societies, and those also usually come with some travel funds to be able to attend. The Jacobs Foundation funds a lot of great work by junior scholars as well as mid-career scholars, and they specifically want to emphasize international collaborations, as does the Templeton World Charity Foundation. The Templeton World Charity Foundation has fairly recently started issuing calls for proposals, especially proposals that are generated from low and middle income countries, and that the lead investigator has to be based in a lower middle income country for some of those specific funding mechanisms. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is another one. There are also a number of countries whose national science foundations have research money that can support international work. So some of this may be just a matter of looking within your country to find out what the funding opportunities are, and even within your university. So when we were getting started, for example, with the Parenting Across Cultures project, we initially submitted a grant proposal to the United States National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, and the reviewers basically liked what we were proposing, but wanted more evidence that it was feasible and that we could actually carry out the proposed work. And so at that point, we applied for a small grant through my university, which we ended up getting. It was just a few $1,000s, but it was enough money that we were able to collect pilot data from mother-child dyads in 6 countries. And then using those pilot data, we were able to publish a couple of papers and then ultimately go back to apply for the larger grant and say, okay, we collected these pilot data, we published these papers, this really is feasible. And then a larger grant proposal was published, in part on the strength of having those pilot data that we collected with the funds that were internal to the university. So those are a few ideas about funding. So, okay, now that you've established this collaboration, and if you want to keep it going, there are a few different ideas for how one could keep these collaborations going. I would suggest that although technology can be great, you can accomplish a lot over email, you can accomplish a lot virtually through Skype or Zoom or other web-based platforms. Excuse me. It's important to meet at least some of the time in person, and preferably where the data are being collected. And I think that these in-person meetings are important for a couple of reasons. One is that it's easier to accomplish sort of very targeted tasks electronically. Like you can send a draft of a manuscript to someone and have them provide feedback and send it back to you electronically. But in terms of really delving into ideas and having in-depth discussions about complicated issues, it's much easier to do that in real time, in person. And you can also be more in tune with the dynamics of the group and whether everyone's ideas are being heard. In person, I think that's easier to do than electronically. And when you're in person, it also offers the advantage of getting to form personal relationships with people, and you can become friends as well as colleagues. And I think that that's not to be minimized in maintaining international collaborations. I think one of the main reasons that this Parenting Across Cultures group, which again is this is us in Kenya here, at least a subset of our group, is that we've truly become good friends over time, as well as collaborators. And these in-person meetings have been a large part of that. Part of the value also in meeting where the data are being collected is that you're able to, as a group, sometimes get a much better feel for the contexts and the challenges and the strengths of different places, and get ideas from each other by seeing how things are working logistically in different sites. So one thing that we've tried to do during our in-person meetings, which happen once a year, and we rotate to different sites. So we've now met in all 9 of the countries where we've been collecting data. but we are sometimes able to go to homes of families that are participating in the project, and that's been a really useful thing for our research. And we've also been able to have a conference that's like a day-long conference at the university that is our collaborating university in each country, and that's also been a good thing, both in terms of reaching out to beyond our project to other faculty and students at these universities, as well as some to the local communities. So typically for the conferences that we have in each of the collaborating sites, people who work with children and families in the local community are invited to come to these conferences. And that can be good from a number of different perspectives. And that kind of in-person meeting allows those sorts of interactions to happen. So a couple of these other tips here about sort of setting concrete goals with deadlines. This, especially with a big group, I think can be really important, because if you don't have concrete goals, then everyone can be on board and say, yes, we want to collaborate, we're really interested in working together, but unless you're working towards something specific as an outcome, those kinds of collaborations can kind of falter. And so the concrete goals can either be data collection goals, they can be goals in terms of writing manuscripts together or doing conference presentations together or having some sort of other concrete outcome. But I think that that making sure that the goal has a collective goal, or that the group has a collective goal, and having deadlines along the way is important. And we typically give each other deadlines too, even for responding to things over email. So in our group, for example, if we circulate a manuscript for feedback, we typically set a turnaround time of 2 weeks and say, please send feedback within 2 weeks. That way, things kind of keep moving along rather than just lingering indefinitely. Authorship, I think, is also a big one for maintaining international collaborations. This is something we've talked about with our group, and to work out what folks think is fair in terms of authorship and beneficial to everyone in the group. Sometimes large working groups, for example, use a corporate authorship name where they name the work group by some collective label, and that's what's used on papers. We have not done that with our working group because at many universities, people don't get credit for being an author if they're just included in the corporate authorship. So we have our working group is named individual authors, for example, on our papers. And I think for international collaborations, it's important to talk up front about how different issues of authorship will be handled so that everyone is in agreement and is having their contributions adequately and appropriately recognized. A couple of different ethics issues that come up in international research. Some of these ethics, I think, are related to research teams themselves, and some of them are related to participants. So I mentioned the SAN Code of Ethics here because in all of this, it's important to adhere to local communities' standards. So the SAN have this Code of Ethics. It's available online, and it's great. It's the community was finding that many outsiders were coming to study them and doing kind of dropping in, doing some sort of data collection, leaving without any real collaboration from the local community or sense that the local community was benefiting in any way from the research. And that's what I'm meaning by extractive science, the last bullet point on this slide here. And I think that to do ethical research, that avoiding this extractive science where people just kind of helicopter in from the outside, do some sort of data collection and leave, never to be heard of from, again, by the local community, is not the way to go. And so part of this adhering to the local community standards has to do with being respectful of local communities, really getting participation from local collaborators, and treating the participants in an ethical way. This issue about age has become important, and it's important for a lot of people who study child development because the age when people are able to provide legal consent varies across countries. And so depending on the local country's standards, as well as requirements of funding agencies, that may affect your consent process. Funders sometimes have different requirements from local communities, depending on what country, for example, the funding is originating in. And And so it's important to be aware of those issues. So to give you a couple of examples from our work on that, one of our data collection sites is in China. And when we first recruited the samples, these were school-based samples. And so once the schools gave permission for the school to participate, locally, there was no requirement that the parents would give consent for their children to participate, because the idea was that once the school gave permission, they were speaking kind of on behalf of the children. But the funding agency said, no, we also have to get parental consent. And so there was a little bit of a mismatch there between what the school and local context said we had to do and what the funders said we had to do. So we've, in our work, kind of gone the way of caution. So in that particular case, we said, well, okay, we recognize that the school, don't require us to get parent consent, but in this case, we are still going to get parent consent, just to be extra cautious, and because that was what the funders required. So there are also things to be aware of when you need to get certain approvals that are from different levels of government agencies. And so anytime you're launching and maintaining a new international collaboration, you'll want to do some checking into the ethics locally about what you need to do to make sure that participants are being treated ethically. So I'll say a little bit about emic versus etic approaches to measurement. So an emic perspective provides a cultural insider's understanding, whereas an etic perspective is someone coming from the outside and trying to understand a group from an outsider's perspective. And there's nothing inherently wrong with either of those approaches. They can both be useful and they can both yield good information. And they don't have to be an either or thing. And I think that some of the best research happens when you try to combine emic and etic approaches to measurement, because there may be things that you as an outsider may not even think to ask about in a particular context as a cultural outsider, whereas someone who's a cultural insider would think, oh yes, that's very important to ask about. So that's really the value of having an emic approach. An etic approach, though, also makes it easier to investigate whether and how similar processes apply across different cultural groups. And sometimes comparison internationally is the goal, sometimes it's not. But especially if there is this goal of any sort of comparison, then sometimes having measures that are the same measures that are used across different cultural groups can be a better way of trying to do those comparisons, rather than having each individual group generate its own measures, because then it can be quite hard to compare. And like I said, comparison is not always the goal, but sometimes it is, and it sometimes depends on what the results of the research are meant to accomplish. So, for example, UNICEF oftentimes has done several waves of what's called the multiple indicator cluster survey, and these draw on nationally representative samples from many countries, over 100 countries to date. And part of that is to give national estimates of things like access to clean drinking water and immunization rates. And part of what's useful about that is that it can be a call to arms for different countries if they realize that, oh, compared to other countries in the region, we're not doing as well on these indicators of maternal health or child development. And it can garner more resources then to do some sort of intervention. So that's an example of when sometimes doing comparisons with more standardized measures can be a very useful thing. Measurement invariance and biases are a big issue in international research. So measurement invariance is the idea of asking whether a particular measure is actually getting at the same question or the same content in different cultural groups and oftentimes across translated versions of measures. And it's an issue that's difficult even with two groups, and it becomes much more complicated the more groups that you're dealing with. There are a number of different statistical approaches to test for measurement invariance, and you can go through. Vandenberg and Lance have a commonly used approach that takes you through different stages of looking at different levels of invariance. And so this is something that if you're trying to publish results using data from multiple countries, this is sure to come up in reviewers' comments. And it's something that you would probably want to think about when you're launching research, so that you can try to handle some of the measurement questions as best as you can early on by careful translation and back translation of measures, by talking through even item by item any difficulties in the translations, and making sure that you're doing all you can up front to ensure that the measures are measuring what you think they are in the different groups that you're assessing. Social desirability biases might also differ across countries. In our groups of the 9 countries in parenting across cultures, for example, we've administered a social desirability scale to mothers and fathers. And if you just look at the means on those scales, the social desirability scores are highest in China and lowest in Sweden in our country. So in many of our analyses, we'll control for the score on the social desirability measure. Social desirability is basically just how much you're trying to present yourself in a socially desirable light to make other people think that what you're doing is good and admirable. And another issue in terms of measurement and biases is just to attend to within versus between country sources of variance. And I'll show you this slide here is just an example of this, because oftentimes when you're doing international research, people will be expecting large differences between countries, but what you might find may be that there are bigger differences within countries than between countries, and that's often what we found in parenting across cultures. So this is just an example to show you the percentage of variance at 3 different levels that are accounted for in a number of different child-reported variables. So a whole bunch of different variables are listed in the left-hand column. And if you look at those different horizontal bars to the right, you can see that the biggest biggest component is accounted for by is within country things rather than between country. The part accounted for by culture, which would be the between culture differences, is at the far right. And so that goes from quite not very much for children's delinquent behavior scores to a little bit more, like 20% or so, for children's report of the normativeness of harsh physical discipline. That's at the very bottom of that list. But still, that leaves 80% of the variance that's accounted for either by between person things within a given culture or error and development over time, things like that. So when you're thinking about international research, be sure you don't forget about within country differences as well as between country differences. And those within country differences can be related to a number of different factors, including differences in children's family experiences or school experiences, urban versus rural distinctions, or within country socioeconomic factors. All of that would account for within country difference, as well as thinking about the between country differences. Thinking too about measurement, I want to say a little bit about rating scales, because this is sometimes an issue in international collaborative research. Especially one issue we've struggled with in our work is whether to use absolute versus relative rating scales. So I give this example here of the Roner Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire. This is a widely used measure in international research, and it's been translated into over 60 languages and used in many different cultural groups. We've used this in our project as well. But I want to illustrate something with the rating scale. So here's an example item. I punish my child severely when I am angry. So the original rating scale goes from 1, almost never true, to 2, rarely true, sometimes true, and almost always true. In our work, for better or worse, and there are advantages and disadvantages, I think, of taking an existing measure and tweaking it in some ways, but we ended up changing the scale to what's listed here, from 1 of never or almost never to 4 every day, but including the anchors of once a month and once a week is in between time points. And the reason we did this is that it's more absolute rather than relative. So our fear in some of the rating scales that we've used is that by saying something like rarely true or sometimes true, it gives the respondents a lot more latitude. Whereas in one group, people may say that rarely true is once a week, whereas rarely true in another group might be once a year. So our thought was by using more absolute rating scales that it gives less leeway for people to interpret the rating scales kind of in different ways. I'll give you one more example about how rating scales may affect your results in international research. These are from the school performance questions from the Achenbach child behavior checklist. And the response options are that parents rate whether their child is failing, is below average, average, or above average. So in our work, we found that parents in different countries use the rating scale differently. So for example, in Sweden, parents are much more likely to say that their child is average than they are in the other countries in our study, which seem to have more of a bias of saying that parents saying their child is above average. And we think this is related to cultural norms. So in Sweden, it's a very, it's a non-hierarchical society in the sense that parents would find it very kind of wrong to say that their child is better than someone else. People are expected to be quite equal. And so we think that, that using that rating scale may not be as much a reflection of how the child is actually doing in school in some cases as whether parents are willing to compare their child favorably with others. Okay, so here is just a plug for balancing standardization and flexibility. This is a participant in China who's completing a computerized task that was part of one of our, or it's been part of a couple of different ways of measurement for us. And I'm using this as a particular example because in some of our sites, it was deemed not safe. This was not the issue in China, but in a couple of our sites, it was deemed not safe for the interviewers to take laptop computers into families' homes because it's such a valuable thing, and it would leave the families and the researchers vulnerable if people were trying to take the laptops. And so in those cases, we had families come to a laboratory to complete the procedures rather than taking the laptops into individual homes. And we thought that was an example of something that was flexible, that met the needs of the communities. And we didn't think it would affect the results in too much of a way that we had to require that everybody complete the procedure in a lab, for example. So that's an example of how there's this balance between making sure that your procedures are standardized across different sites, but also making sure that they're flexible enough that they respond to needs of local communities. Payment is another issue. So how you're going to compensate your participants. We've tried to come up with compensation amounts that are appropriately motivating, but not coercive in any particular site. And that's for ethical reasons as well. And in some sites, participants are not allowed to be paid in cash, for example, and donations can be made to schools, or other ways of compensating people might be needed to, is a way that you'd be flexible in responding to what the local requirements are without jeopardizing the scientific integrity of the work. I'll say a little bit about capacity building too, because this can happen in a number of different ways. So I mentioned earlier that our Parenting Across Cultures group has done a one-day conference, typically in conjunction with our project meeting each year when we're in different places. This poster here and the picture of a part of our group anyway was from our meeting earlier this year in Thailand. And so the capacity building happens in a number of different ways. There can be an increase in research infrastructure at the collaborating universities as they work out the logistics of how to work together in these international collaborations. There can also be community outreach. So for example, by inviting people who work with families in the local community to these conferences, in our case. And faculty and student exchanges, I think, are another good thing that can come out of these international collaborations. So that can involve faculty spending periods of time at each other's university. It can also involve students who might come and spend a month or even a semester at each other's universities, and those are all great at building capacity. I list here a couple of references on international collaborations that my colleagues and I have put together. The first one was published earlier this year and came out of the International Affairs Committee of the Society for Research in Child Development. And the members of the committee are at the time were co-authors on the article, and it gives some of the tips that I've talked about today. And then the second one here is our Parenting Across Cultures group has put together this article that really isn't so much tips on conducting international research as much as benefits and kinds of the things that you can learn about child development from conducting international collaborative research. So I will stop there with the formal part of the presentation. Please feel free to follow up with me by email. I'd be happy to answer questions that way. And there's also time now that I can respond to questions during this last bit of the webinar. So thank you very much.